I think I've learned the same lessons repeatedly. So I'd say the first one is just about mental resilience, I suppose. If you just keep going, you can really achieve some pretty impressive physical feats. It's always your mind that gives up first before something breaks or snaps. But the other one, I suppose, is that these sorts of expeditions are not solo adventures. So they are not like one man or two man's brave conquering of the wilderness or, us against nature or us against Madagascar. They are very much team effort. So there's no way Ben and I would have survived had we not had the assistance of not just our guides, but all of the other people that we met in Madagascar along the way who helped us in some way, whether that was giving us shelter, offering us food, giving us advice as to which way to go on the river or how to avoid danger.
Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. Today we're talking with Oscar Scafidi. Oscar is a Guinness World Record holder and recently released his book, Kayak the Mangoky, which is a vivid retelling of his wild journey, kayaking Madagascar's longest river. Hi, Oscar. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Richard.
First off, I want to say I love the book. I read it on a Sunday by the fire. So it was a great adventure for a place I didn't know anything about. Like, outside of the movie Madagascar, I really kind of didn't know anything about Madagascar.
Yeah, it's one of those lesser visited parts of the world, isn't it? I had the fortune, I suppose, of actually having lived and worked there for a while. So I was based in Madagascar for 2 years, 2017 to 2019. So I had a pretty good understanding of what I was getting myself into. A few years later, when my friend Ben and I decided we're going to kayak the longest river on the island.
Now, you have a history of living and exploring in sub-Saharan countries, and I was wondering, what draws you to these places?
Originally, sheer luck, I suppose. After university, I very randomly accepted a job teaching in Sudan. I had no background traveling around Africa back when I accepted that job. That was in 2006. In fact, I'd never been outside Western Europe up until that point. So I basically just graduated from university, didn't really know what to do with myself, and on a whim accepted this role in Sudan. And it kind of snowballed from there. I realized I was really in love with that part of the world. I really love teaching, which is what I went out there to do. And so those two things have kind of grown over the past 20 years.
And you've written guidebooks about lesser visited countries in sub-Saharan Africa. You've done another, first descent of a major river in Angola. And you've lived in Africa for a long time. How does that long-term exposure to, such a different culture from Western Europe change about how you think about travel and belonging?
I think it's definitely changed my perspective over time. So I've lived, worked, and traveled across 35 countries in Africa over the past 20 years. And I think I've spent the majority of my adult life living in Africa since I first moved out to Sudan in 2006. I think when I first went to Sudan, I really had no idea what to expect. I'd quite literally never been outside Western Europe. So it was a complete culture shock to me to go to a very lesser visited part of Africa. I mean, not that many people were visiting Sudan back in 2006. And I think that really just opened my eyes to the incredible diversity on the continent, both in terms of language and in terms of culture. And I think from there, I just realized this was the place for me. This is where I wanted to explore. I think my viewpoint has probably changed quite a lot between 2006 and now. I think perhaps I had quite a sort of Orientalist view of Africa and how exotic and exciting and different it was back then. And I do look back at some of my earlier travel writing and sort of wince at the way I portrayed some of the places that I lived and worked and traveled around. But I think now it's home, basically.
Now, large parts of Africa are still kind of totally off the tourist map. And, you've written guidebooks. I think it was one for Angola. Was the other one for Guinea or the Gold Coast?
I've written 2 guidebooks to Angola. I've written a guidebook to Equatorial Guinea. And most recently, I've written a guidebook to Tunisia, which is the first place in Africa that actually has an established tourism industry and had one before I started writing about it. So that was a bit of a new adventure for me to go somewhere that was slightly more sort of on the beaten path.
What do you think keeps people from exploring all these, relatively unknown countries in Africa?
I think there's a lot of misconceptions around Africa. I think it has a lot of negative stereotypes, some of which are linked to political instability and other negative situations from back in the 80s and 90s that people just sort of hold on to as if that's still the case today. So I think a lot of these countries have an unfair reputation and people just sort of write them off. So, I mean, Angola is a classic example. So Angola had a civil war that ran from 1975 all the way through till 2002. And I think people still look at it from that lens, from a Western perspective. So they just think, well, it must be dangerous because it's a war zone. But I mean, that was more than 20 years ago. And now I would say it's an absolute ecotourism paradise. So I would really encourage people to perhaps not take places at their first sort of the first Google story that they find from many, many years ago, and perhaps do a little bit more research and reconsider some of these locations.
And yeah, they're a chance to kind of get off the beaten path. We're seeing a lot of the popular destinations worldwide, but even in Africa are suffering from over tourism because people know, oh, I'm going to go to South Africa, I'm going to go to Kili, I'm going to go to the Serengeti. Those are all great places, but there's almost too much love for those, and there is a benefit of going to these places that don't have the crowds. You have a more authentic experience, can have maybe a more meaningful experience, although, obviously not get the Instagram clout maybe by, not having, your photo on the top of Kili or something like that. But they offer a really compelling option for people that want to explore and really have an authentic journey, I think.
Well, absolutely. I think social media has been a bit of a mixed blessing. It's certainly giving people a whole other viewpoint of these unexplored places and encouraging them to go and visit them. And I think at the same time, a lot of governments in Africa are now realizing that tourism is a very sustainable revenue stream that they should be developing. So one of the major issues has been that it's been very difficult to visit a lot of these countries because the visa processes have been quite burdensome. So why would you jump through all of the hoops of going to an embassy and providing paperwork and yada, 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 when you could just, fly to South Africa, land and get stamped in immediately? So, for example, Angola has just dropped their visa requirements for the vast majority of nationalities. When I first moved there in 2009, it was extremely difficult to get in. I don't think a tourist visa even existed. You were either working there or you were Angolan. Those were your two options. Now you can just show up and go on holiday. So I think that is also changing and making things a lot easier to actually go and visit these places.
Speaking of Angola, that was your first major kayaking expedition, or at least, your first book about kayaking where you kayaked the Kwanzaa River. Can you maybe share a little bit about that trip and how that came about?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was the brainchild of my friend, Alfie Weston. He's a Brit. I knew him from Angola because he was living and working there at the same time as me. And essentially, he decided, because he already had a Klepper collapsible kayak in the country, he was quite into kayaking. He sort of took a look at the river and realized no one had ever done this before. So he pitched the idea to me of trying to kayak the whole thing from source to sea. I think he knew I was the only person that would be stupid enough to say yes. So in sort of mid 2015, we started preparing. We spent about 9 months getting ready. And then in 2016, we went and did it.
And the Klepper kayak features in your new book. I think it was also the collapsible kayak that Paul Thoreau would use in his books when he'd go out and about. I should have checked that, but I remember he had a wooden collapsible kayak. Can you talk a little bit about the Klepper kayak, because it's definitely different from what most people think of when they think of kayaking in a river?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, Klepper's a German company. They invented this particular collapsible kayak at the turn of the century, so in the early 1900s, and it was a winning formula. So it hasn't really changed for the past 100 or so years. So it's essentially a wooden skeleton, a light, usually birchwood skeleton, where you kind of put that together, and then you have a skin that you pull over it, and you've got a kayak that's ready to go. So the one that we used was designed for 2 men. So it's about 5.5 meters long. So it is a big, long kayak that you can fit a lot of gear into. But unfortunately, it's also relatively heavy when you break it down. So it ends up being about 40 kilos. And obviously for sections of portage where you actually need to carry rather than paddling, you have to have that on your back in addition to all of the other gear you need to survive. So yeah, we ended up carrying that thing quite a lot on both our Angola expedition and our Madagascar expedition.
So what drew you to this Madagascar expedition to kayak the Mangoky?
I think I had planned to do it many years before I did it. So when I moved to Madagascar in 2017 to teach at an international school in the capital, Antananarivo, and as soon as I arrived, I thought I started looking around for the longest river because it was only I moved out there a year after having kayaked the Kwanza River in Angola. So it's still fresh in my mind. And I thought, yep, this hasn't been done. It looks like it could be doable. I started planning then and there. But then, work got in the way. I lived there for 2 years. I then moved. Then COVID happened. So it was not possible to go back for a while. And then it got to around 2022. And I decided it's sort of now or never. And so my friend Ben and I went back and did it. But I think one of the things that attracted me to it was the fact, as far as I could see, it had never been done before. It also looked doable in the sense that from the satellite photography, large sections of the river looked navigable. And lastly, I had lived in the country, so I had a support network in place. I had an understanding of the way the bureaucracy worked. I don't think I'd ever want to do a journey like that or an expedition in a country that I was arriving in for the first time. I think it's really important to have that support network in place and that understanding, that sort of cultural understanding of how things work in that particular country to do it safely.
You mentioned you recruited your friend Ben to do this expedition in Madagascar. What makes a good partner, a great partner in such a challenging expedition like this?
Yeah, I think you already have to know each other very well. You certainly don't want to do it with someone that's a stranger or someone that you're going to get to know over the course of the journey. So both in the case of Alfie and Ben, I had known them for years before we actually went on these expeditions. I think you've got to have a good system of communication in place because you're going to be with each other isolated 24/7 for weeks at a time, and that can obviously lead to frayed tempers and that sort of thing. So if you don't have a good communication strategy and you don't have a way of sort of resolving conflict very quickly, things can actually get quite dangerous because obviously you need to be communicating with each other openly, constantly about concerns on the river, concerns about your health, those sorts of things. Otherwise, you can get into danger quite quickly.
I wouldn't mind if you can maybe just share a little bit about Madagascar, because I'm sure there's lots of listeners that were like me that kind of didn't know, anything other than it's an island off the coast of Africa. But can you talk maybe a little bit about the geography and the history and, some of the things you knew having lived there for a couple years that obviously people who hadn't been there, wouldn't know?
Yeah, it's a really unique island. People talk about it. Some people call it the eighth continent because it's so different to not just mainland Africa, but anywhere else. So because it's an island and because it's been an island for so long, the flora and fauna there have evolved in completely different directions. So you've got huge numbers of endemic flora and fauna. I suppose the most famous one you've already mentioned from the film Madagascar, the cute lemurs bouncing around in the trees. You find them nowhere else. And you've got plenty of other animals and plants that are exactly the same. So yeah, it's a huge island. I think it's like 1,600 kilometers long. It's completely different to mainland Africa, even though you've just got the Mozambique Channel there between Madagascar and Mozambique. The people of Madagascar are very, very different to the people next door in Mozambique. The reason for that is actually they are not descended from mainland Africa at all. They are actually descended from Indonesia. So specifically the islands around Borneo. So weirdly, when you look at it geographically, you would assume that Madagascar was settled from the west, that people got into boats and sailed across from Mozambique to Madagascar. Well, that's not actually the case. So actually they sailed all the way east from Indonesia across the entire Indian Ocean and arrived in Madagascar. And you see it the minute you arrive. You see the rice paddies, you just see the sort of technology when it comes to farming, when it comes to fishing. The people themselves, they look much more like they're from that part of the world, the eastern side of the Indian Ocean, rather than looking like they come from the east coast of Africa. So it's completely unique and fascinating. And you see those links, you see them in the language, you see them in the food and the culture. So yeah. The island itself, in terms of the geography, there's a huge spine of mountains that goes right up the middle. And the river that we were kayaking, called the Mangoky, essentially starts in the sort of center east of the country and then heads westwards through those mountains and then down into the Mozambique Channel on the western side of the island.
Can you talk a little bit about the security situation? In the book, you allude to, in the past, there were some security issues as you got into this rural or, this mountainous region in the center, as well as talk a little bit about the development there. I was surprised at one point, your book talked about how you were paying these guys, I think it was $4 a day for them to go on this, what seemed like a hellish journey. And you just couldn't believe how little, they were charging. And so for someone who's thinking of going there, what can they expect around those two aspects?
There is a lot of poverty there. It is not a very developed economy. Most people are subsistence farmers, or they're doing other subsistence activities like fishing to survive. In terms of security, I would say that the security situation in Madagascar is relatively good. They haven't had a war or anything like that, as you've had in sort of neighboring Mozambique. However, you do have big sections of the countryside where the presence of the state is very minimal. And we were heading through one of those sections. So there is, or there used to be, quite a significant issue with banditry and cattle rustling. So there was a particular group called the Dahalo, whose entire modus operandi was cattle theft. So they'd be heavily armed. Most people's source of wealth in that part of the country is stored in the form of cattle. So everything revolves around cattle. So I suppose that's the most valuable thing that you can possibly steal from someone. So they go around and take these cattle from other people, and it's turned into quite a big organized crime operation. So huge problems with that in the past few years. We were unsure how serious that problem still was in 2022, because obviously quite hard to get information about that normally, and especially hard to get information about that during COVID times when everything was a bit more locked down. There's less information coming out. So I had a contact of mine who's a British explorer called Chaz Powell. He actually walked the width of Madagascar. I think it was in 2019. So he went from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast with a couple of other people. And he walked straight through the same area that we went through. And he had a fair few problems with the Dahalo and the insecurity there. So we were kind of retracing some of his footsteps 2.5 or 3 years later. And we were a little bit concerned that we were going to face some of those same issues. But luckily for us, the situation seemed to have cleared itself up quite nicely before we arrived. So we didn't have to worry too much about our personal security while we're doing the hiking sections.
You talk a little bit about trying to just, understand the security situation when you're not there. Your book starts with just trying to find the source of the Mangkok. And I was kind of like, I remember reading books about, finding the source of the Nile, and I think it was like the 1800s. And I was like, this is wild that with satellites and, all this information, it was so tough. Why is it so tough to do something like just find the source?
Yeah, it was odd because I remember with the Angola trip in 2016, finding the source of the Kwanzaa was not a problem at all. There's a Wikipedia page which has a GPS location on it, and that's the source. And when you actually drive down there, I mean, admittedly, it's in quite a rural area, but it's actually signposted. Like from the main road, there's a sign that says source of the Kwanzaa, and you drive there, and it's very obviously the source of the Kwanzaa, and it's marked. So we were kind of hoping for that for Madagascar, but that was not to be. So firstly, there wasn't too much agreement as to which tributary of the Mangok was the sort of official longest tributary or whichever, because there's all sorts of geeky hydrological arguments or kayaking arguments as to what constitutes the beginning of a river. Is it the point of the tributary that's furthest away from the end? Is it the one that feeds the most water into it? There's sort of 3 or 4 different definitions. So we had to battle with that firstly. And then once we decided, okay, it's definitely this tributary, then which was the Matsiatra, then we had to try and find the source of the Matsiatra, which was impossible, basically. The best we could do was find some sort of obscure 1990s French hydrology report of the entire country that made some sort of passing reference to the source, but it only said that it's sort of at the base of this mountain, which is obviously not a particularly precise location. So that was the best we had to go on. We knew it was near this mountain, so that we had to go and actually find it for ourselves at the beginning of the expedition. And we had no idea how long that was going to take, which was a bit inconvenient.
Now, one thing that was interesting is that this was not just a continuous kayak all the way down. You had quite a significant portage. And I know here in the Canadian Rockies, when I go whitewater canoeing, like, a 500-meter portage is a real pain in the butt. Um, at first, when I was reading about the portages, I'm like, this is a typo. There's an error in this, but it wasn't. Can you talk a little bit about the portage? Because it's like, I've never heard of portages like this. Not even this length, even up in, northern Canada, where you can have them of, 5 or 6 kilometers at times.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, firstly, we were relying on satellite photography that was from the 1980s. That was the most recent Passover. So we had very out of date imagery of the actual rivers with which to judge which sections were navigable and which sections weren't navigable. So yeah, that was the first problem. And then we had a local team helping us, and our chief guide Max, absolute legend, kept us safe, kept us alive. He had been to certain sections of the river, so he was able to chime in terms of what was navigable, what wasn't. But our plan changed like on the fly, on the ground, 4 or 5 times. So I simplified that whole story very much, both in the book and the film, simply because it was too complicated to get into, and probably not that interesting for your average reader or viewer. But yeah, we had to change the plan so many times because we realized that there were too many rapids at this particular time of year. The gorges had got a lot steeper since the 1980s. They're inaccessible. I think there was one canyon that Max said he didn't want us kayaking through because he called it Crocodile Canyon. He said it's just absolutely full of crocodiles at that time of year, and we're basically just going to get eaten. So we had to change that plan as well. So yeah, I think we went into it thinking worst case scenario, maybe we're going to have to kayak and portage about 70 to 100 kilometers, absolute worst case scenario. And then we ended up having to do 200, 220, maybe even 250. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but like far worse than we could have possibly imagined. So a lot of hard work. And this wasn't just portage along a flat bit next to the river. This was portage through the mountain range, which was about as bad as it gets.
Was also portage where you didn't know, like, there wasn't a path that was obvious to go on. You were actually trying to figure out how the heck do we get over this? So again, it's like thinking to my experience, oh, well, you know exactly where to go. But there's just, so much uncertainty that you're dealing with throughout this whole expedition. And like, how do you deal with that much uncertainty going in and dealing with it? It was almost like an expedition from 100 years ago where, you have a vague map and that's all you
Yeah.
have.
Yeah, really, we did have to work a lot of stuff out on the fly, on the ground, and the plan had to be changed a lot, and we had to be very flexible. I was quite surprised at how little information we were able to gather in advance. So yeah, we knew going into it that the plan that we had was probably not going to survive contact with reality because there were just so many unknowns at the beginning. And yeah, going the portage through the mountains was very frustrating because obviously we had very fancy GPS devices and our satellite communicator. So we knew exactly where we were. Like we could tell you our precise GPS location, but that was completely useless. That didn't tell us where we needed to go because it's impossible to walk in a straight line through a mountain range. So we did a lot of wiggling and trekking, and we thought it was going to take X amount of kilometers. It ended up taking double or triple that because of all the switchbacks and that sort of thing. I remember one day up in the mountains, a particularly bad crossing we did. We thought it would take 3.5 days. It ended up taking 9. And that's when we ran out of water. But anyway, one day we started going, we're trying to go west. We hiked all day. We looked at our GPS location. We were further east than when we'd started. We'd walked in a huge sort of dog leg to get round a mountain and then stopped before we'd actually gone round it. So we're kind of behind the start line for the day, which was really, really frustrating, but there was no option. That was the only way the path went. So we had to just follow it.
The book goes through lots of highs and lows for you, all these unknowns that end up being harder or more challenging, as well as both you and Ben dealt with some pretty serious illnesses. Can you maybe talk about how morale fluctuates? I think what you experience is not something people experience in their regular life. And to go from, almost euphoria to despair and back and forth so quickly, how do you deal with something like that?
Well, I think the first thing is to just recognize you can't control it. So it's going to happen. So I suppose being aware that it's going to happen, it helps quite a lot. because at least you could prepare yourself mentally for that. I think the Angola trip in 2016 was a little bit harder for both me and Alfie because we didn't have any prior experience of that type. We didn't realize just how difficult things were going to get. At least with the Madagascar trip in 2022, I was able to talk to Ben about it and we could come up with some strategies for dealing with it. But basically, you just have to sort of compartmentalize your day and just understand that doesn't matter how bad you feel right now, give it an hour, it might feel better, it might feel worse, but give it 2 hours, give it 4 hours. Tomorrow, a meal might make a difference. Having a rest, having a drink of water might make a difference. Just got to kind of not extrapolate outwards too much into the future. Just deal with things 1 hour at a time, and then it's a little bit more manageable. But yeah, it's still surprising to me how quickly you could get sort of super, super depressed at a setback, or super elated at quite a small thing. Usually revolved around food, the happiness, I would say. We're very food motivated throughout that journey because we're so hungry the whole time.
Once you got over the portage and past all the rapids, it seemed like a very mellow, enjoyable trip. And then all of a sudden you were able to kind of relax and enjoy. Obviously, you were really ill during that point in time, but all of a sudden there were villages that would have food that they would sell you, and you could, find luxuries like a bottle of Coke or some fried snacks. Is that a fair statement that, the second half of the trip is something that is maybe more accessible to, other people who want to go on a remote kayaking expedition?
Yeah, absolutely. So once we hit the Mangok proper, it was beautiful. Yeah, no more rapids, no more waterfalls, no more portage. It was fantastic. Big, wide, generally fast flowing, so that helps you along. And yeah, we actually passed an old colonial ruin in a reserve, and I found out afterwards that that there's like a tour company offering kayak trips up and down that section. So they do actually take tourists up and down there. And I remember we commented at the time, this would be a fantastic ecotourism opportunity because it's so easy. Like it's so flat and you just stop on the beach and you camp and it's beautiful and it's relatively safe. So yeah, that was a nice end to the journey, especially considering what came before it.
Now, the formal end is in the Mozambique Channel. What was surprising to me is there was still a massive journey just to get back to civilization. It's not like you're at a town and you can, jump on a road for a couple hours. It was a long trip back. And I was wondering, you mentioned in the book after kayaking the Kwanzaa, you were kind of like back in London in a day or two. This one, it was a bit more sedate. And how did this differ, going on this long journey back to civilization and taking some time off versus immediately going back to the big city after your trip in Angola?
I think the end of the Madagascar trip was much better, but that was also by design, having learned my lesson at the end of the Angola trip. So yeah, the river in Angola and the river in Madagascar spit you out in very different places. So at the end of the Angola trip, we were an hour's drive, maybe less, from the capital city, and there was a lodge on the beach there. So we had people waiting for us at the finish line. We had a massive meal, like a big party, and then straight back to the capital city and straight back into it, back into a kind of urban metropolis, which I found quite jarring. And then from there on a plane back to London. And I really didn't like that transition. I found that after a month of being isolated and out in nature, it really didn't feel good to suddenly be surrounded by cars and noise and people. So at the end of the Madagascar trip, we got spat out into nowhere. There's like a fishing village and that's it. And then we had to take, I think, a 6-hour speedboat ride north just to get to the nearest sort of town that was connected to a road. And then even from that point, we then had to drive for like a whole day to get back to the capital city. And I think that gave a sort of opportunity for decompression for both Ben and I, which was really good. Even when we got back to the capital, we took a few days there. Then we went our separate ways, and I actually went to Mauritius from there, which is actually quite a short jump east. And I spent some time alone, just in an Airbnb, because I knew that I didn't really want to be around big crowds of people. I think that would have kind of upset me slightly, having had a whole month of just Ben and I hanging out in a tent and having the countryside all around us. So yeah, I think a lot of people talk about this after big expeditions, the shock that they have when they sort of go back to civilization. So that's something we're very aware of after the Madagascar trip.
You've now completed 2 source to sea expeditions. I wonder what you've learned as a result of these 2, great trips. How has it kind of influenced your life?
I think I've learned the same lessons repeatedly, which I found quite surprising. So I'd say the first one is just about mental resilience, I suppose. It is pretty incredible. It was pretty incredible to me, especially in Angola, what I could get my body to do. So I'm certainly not an athlete. Um, so yeah, I think if you just keep going, you can really achieve some pretty impressive physical feats. It's always your mind that gives up first before something breaks or snaps. So, or at least that's been my experience. So yeah, that I had no idea that I was capable of, kayaking 75K in a day or carrying this big thing over this long distance over the course of X amount of days. So yeah, that was the first lesson. And I suppose that was just reinforced in Madagascar when we're carrying this ridiculously heavy packs over these mountain ranges with no water. But the other one, I suppose, is that these sorts of expeditions are not solo adventures. So they are not like one man or two man's brave conquering of the wilderness, or us against nature or us against Madagascar. They are very much team effort. So there's no way Ben and I would have survived had we not had the assistance of not just our guides, but all of the other people that we met in Madagascar along the way who helped us in some way, whether that was giving us shelter, offering us food, giving us advice as to which way to go on the river or how to avoid danger. So it always kind of makes me laugh when I see some of these adventure films or adventure books that sort of really highlight the sort of macho individual aspect of the trip without acknowledging that it's not that much of an individual endeavor.
In both these expeditions, you've also taken on real physical and logistical risks. Like these are tough things to figure out and then to execute. What's your philosophy on risk versus reward in adventure? And again, has it influenced how you live your life? Like, are you willing to take more risks on a day-to-day basis after doing these 2 big trips than maybe you would have done if you hadn't done them?
I think it's probably the opposite. I think I'm probably quite risk averse in my day-to-day life. I think risk lives in 2 different boxes in my head. I think on the expeditions, I have a certain risk tolerance, and in my everyday life, I have a very different risk tolerance. And I suppose that's just kind of through exposure and understanding risk a bit more. I mean, I'm perfectly willing to expose myself to pretty significant risks if I think it's for some sort of worthwhile reason, whether that be, doing one of these big expeditions or raising money for charity or having some sort of new experience that's then going to lead to some sort of creative project. I think those are all good reasons to take risks. But still, we do try and mitigate them as much as possible. Like there's months and months of work that goes into one of these trips to make sure that we don't end up hurting ourselves or worse. So far, it's worked out okay.
And you did this trip for charity, you mentioned just before. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the charity you did this for?
Yeah, certainly. So we raised money for a sort of grassroots Malagasy educational NGO called Our Kids, Our Future Madagascar. And they have a very simple modus operandi. They just get kids back into primary school. So rather sadly, due to rural poverty, a lot of families find that they have to pull their kids out of school because they can't afford the very simple school supplies required to send them to school, whether that's like a book or a pencil or whatever, the very, very small fees that they have to pay to attend. So they just take the money to pay the enrollment fees or get the equipment for the child, and then the child's straight back in school. So it's an extremely effective way of ensuring that these children have access to an education. And it's also very cost effective because from the donor's perspective, it costs very little money to get each of those children back into school and back into education, which I think is fantastic. Being from a teaching background, I'm a big believer in the importance of education. So I think every kid deserves to have access to a decent education, and they certainly shouldn't miss out on it because they don't have the money.
That sounds beautiful that you're able to help kids while doing this great expedition. Oscar, thanks for making time to come on the show today. I really enjoyed hearing more about the expedition.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
If people want to learn more, where can they find more about you or the expedition?
Well, we have a 41-minute documentary film about the expedition, which is on YouTube if people want to watch it. So that's on my YouTube channel, which is Scafidi Travels. I also have a book out about the expedition. At the moment, it's an ebook, which you can find on Amazon. So that's Kayak the Mangoky. We are going to be bringing out the paperback just before Christmas, I think, but we'll see. And apart from that, yeah, I suppose all the information about the expedition is on our official website. So if you go to www.kayakthemangoky.com, it's all up there.
I'll put links to those in the show notes. And Mangkok is actually spelt with a Y at the end.
It is, yeah.
So that is something that I found out I was saying it wrong before we started this interview. So it sounds like Mangoky.
It does have a Y at the end. And to be honest, I was saying it wrong for the entirety of the expedition and all through the documentary film. So don't worry, you're not the only one.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone, for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Perfect.
Brilliant.
Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.